Hello, everyone. I'm Eric Lorberer. I'm the director of Rain Taxi. It's such a pleasure to welcome you to our second event of 2021. Feeling more hopeful by the day. And we have many events this year, so I hope that you will be checking our website and coming back to some of the great authors we have in store for you. Tonight, we're really privileged to be speaking with Damion Searls. Damion is a prolific and esteemed translator of literature from several languages. This is a great opportunity for all of us literature lovers to say thank you to the translators who make it possible for us to read so many things. It is an incalculable gift.
Well, thank you
Uh,
to the readers who make it possible for us to translate it. So the feeling's mutual.
Indeed, it's a symbiotic relationship. Um, I want to say also, though, that in addition to translating so much work, including, I think, half a dozen Nobel Prize winners, Damion is an author in English as well. And we're going to touch on that a little bit toward the end of today's session if we have time, because, of course, we are going to be talking in depth today about Damien's wonderful new translation of Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet. Finally, though, I want to say on a personal note that uh, although a longtime New Yorker, Damion has recently relocated to Minneapolis. And so we are actually in the same town, about a mile away from each other on separate screens. And it's a delight to have you here, even though, of course, we are hard pressed to show you our fair city at this time. But how are you finding Minnesota in the winter?
Well, it would be much more fun to be hanging out in person before and after the event than on screen. But can't complain.
Yeah, indeed. Well, we'll get to it eventually. I look forward to it. And meanwhile, thanks for being with us tonight. Uh, Thank you so much for this incredible new book. But before we leap into it, I just want to give our viewers a little background on yourself. Um, if I understand correctly, your PhD is in American literature. How did you find your way toward, toward a life in translation?
Um, uh, well, first of all, thanks for having me, and for thanks to everyone for taking the time to listen to us chat about Roca and whatever else. In a way, it was just parallel. I didn't sort of start in English and then move to translation. I was kind of getting interested in translation in parallel. And doing my PhD in English was just sort of keeping that separate from my creative life, which in my mind included the translation. So I didn't study translation or go to a German department or anything like that. I was just, writing and translating kind of on the side as I went through grad school, and continued after that to be a more non-academic translator than most. Like many writers in America, most translators in America have teaching jobs as their day jobs, and um, also, to a greater or lesser extent, kind of see the university or the academy as their home base for translation. Um, Whereas I'm a full-on freelancer, and both professionally, but then also creatively, and just doing the translation as on the literary side as opposed to the academic side, insofar as they're opposed. So the degree in English didn't really feed into this per se, uh, except that the more you read, the better a translator you are, because ultimately you're writing in English.
Right, right. Yeah, it is interesting to sort of think about the connections. I know, for example, that you've published a a book of Thoreau's journal, and uh, and sort of thinking about a figure like Thoreau in combination with a writer like Rilke and some of their shared concerns and that remain our concerns to this day, it becomes more fascinating the more those
Yeah.
connections are made.
Uh, yeah, we can maybe get back to the specific Thoreau stuff later, but to your general point, I agree. I guess I kind of see myself as a generalist. So I've done sort of professional championing of translators from Chinese poetry, and the Thoreau, the knowledge of Thoreau does kind of enrich my sense of what Rilke is doing. I mean, just the really short version is that, like Proust, who was very influenced by Emerson, and like Thoreau, who was very influenced by Emerson, Rilke, who got his through Nietzsche, extremely influenced by Emerson. All these figures are kind of dealing with, in an increasingly secular, increasingly industrialized world, where sort of the old answers to the questions of the meaning of life are starting to feel less satisfactory. How do they sort of build their own meaning and their own sense of value and community, and how to overcome the isolation we all have as like atomized individuals? And it's true, not that many people think about Thoreau and Proust and Rilke kind of in the same box. But once you put them there, I think it really does make sense. The craziest factoid on that front is that Proust actually considered translating Walden into French, which pretty much, if you've read those books, kind of boggles your mind, like what Walden by Proust would have been like. But what Proust liked was this sense that he got when he read Thoreau, that there's this intimate inner voice that he could hear so clearly speaking to him from Thoreau's text. And of course, that's the feeling you get reading Proust, and that's also what Rilke is talking about and kind of putting into practice in the Letters to a Young Poet, that have felt to millions of people over the decades like, oh my God, Rilke's talking to me.
Right, right. Well, that seems like the perfect transition moment to talk about this wonderful book. There is so much packed into it, not the least of which is the letters from Coppice. And so I am curious, I, you know, if you'll tell us how this came to be, and specifically, were you motivated by that discovery? Is it part of the origin story of this new translation?
Yeah, so yes and no. I was talking to the publisher, which is Liveright, is part of Norton, and the editor there sort of said, "Oh, what do you think about letters to doing a new translation of Letters to a Young Poet?" Because as we'll talk about probably in a bit, there've of course been many translations over the years, and I would say the two kind of standouts of the Letters to a Young Poet specifically are the M.D. Herder Norton translation, and that is in fact Norton as in Norton. M.D. Using her initials is a woman, as one might have guessed from people 80 years ago. Using their initials was often women. And this is in fact the Mrs. Norton of the husband and wife team that founded Norton, the publishers. So it's been kind of important to them in terms of how they see themselves and the history of their firm, that they've kept this old classic first translation in print all these years, but they were ready as they approached the centennial of their company and so forth to have a new translation, which they've never done before. So in the sort of extremely irrelevant inside baseball of publishing, it's like a big deal to them to like be retranslating it. The other one is Stephen Mitchell, who has translated, of course, both the poetry and the letters to a young poet. And so the first thing I did when they asked me, like, what do you think? Would you want to do a new translation of this? Was to look at these earlier translations, as well as 3 or 4 others that have come out recently, and just ask myself, you know, do I have anything new to offer? Is there any point? I mean, would I just be producing basically the same book that's already been produced? And I came up with 2 conclusions. One is that, yes, the translation would be different enough and sort of newer enough and take a different angle on it in ways we might talk about, that it would be worth it. But I also found out that literally weeks before I was looking into it, the letters from the young poet to Rilke had just been published, literally weeks before I was looking into, is there any point in doing a new edition? And so sure enough, some scholar, there's the Rilke archive that all the scholars have used for decades, but then there's the private family archive of Rilke's descendants that, and they're more private and they don't sort of show it around to everybody. And this scholar had kind of developed a relationship with them and eventually been like, hey, does this archive have the letters that Rilke received? And they were like, yeah, sure. No one's ever asked. Here they are, more or less. So, and so scholars and translators had been saying in print, you know, as recently as a couple years ago, oh, the letters are lost, but here's Rilke's side of the correspondence. And in fact, no, the letters aren't lost. Like, so that certainly became a very obvious reason to do a new edition, because now, aside from the new translation, it really has something completely new and changing your sense of the book, in that it's a real conversation. It's not just Rilke pronouncing on things. He's actually, you know, answering this kid's questions.
Yeah, yeah. Boy, I don't find it all that hard to believe that no one had asked to see them or pressed to see them. Because, you know, the thing that shocked me the minute I saw your book come out is sort of like, oh yeah, there were letters from a poet to it. Like you sort of, it fades so quickly, it becomes a conceit that Rilke was responding to someone just to say all this stuff he had to say.
Yeah,
So it's
and I
sort of,
mean,
yeah.
in a way, one of the most important things about the book is that it is from 2 different times. So the letters back and forth are mostly from 1903, 1904. And at that point, Rilke himself is 27. He's not an old man. He's not like a wise old elder. He's 27, but that's older enough for the, you know, 18-year-olds to look up to. And the thing is that the letters were first published in German shortly after Rilke died. It was Kappas himself who made the decision to include only the letters from Rilke, not his own letters, which he could have included.
Sure.
And he wrote a short little introduction explaining, like, there I was in my schoolyard and I ran into a teacher who had had him before, and that made me think, oh, maybe I can reach out and write to him. But of course, after Rilke's death, when it was first published, Rilke wasn't some 27-year-old guy. He was the author of the Duino Elegies and the Sonnets to Orpheus and, you know, the major European poet. So from the beginning, every reader of this book has kind of known that Rilke isn't just some 27-year-old guy. He's the guy who was going to go on to. So that has meant that his letters carry all this authority that they didn't originally have because Rilke hadn't done anything yet. I mean, he'd done stuff, but not the great stuff. So even his side of the correspondence by itself has this duality of like, I'm a relatable, sympathetic 27-year-old guy who's like letting you know my struggles, but we all know that I prevailed and wrote the Duino elegies in later decades.
Yeah, yeah. I want to pause just to tell the audience that some of you are already using the chat. Way to go! And feel free as the conversation continues. I'm sure you'll have your own reminiscences of your experiences with Rilke or this book, and maybe your experiences with that act of letter writing, that intimate act of responding to someone's query and emboldening them and heartening them in some way. I think that is something, again, in this strange time that we're rediscovering an aspect of that communication. Also, if you have a question for Damion, don't forget you can put it in the question box. We will be getting to as many of those as we can. I
Just to
don't want to.
follow
Oh,
up what you said, though, the letter writing relationship was both um, the exciting thing and also the challenge of this edition, frankly, because this is a book that for almost a century readers have felt that Rilke's talking to me, and that's why everyone buys it as graduation presents and like reads it as a young person and all this kind of stuff. And it's very illuminating to see him actually in response to someone. He's not just bringing up a topic because he feels like spouting off about, sex life or irony or whatever it is. He's actually answering a question, or there's some other questions that he decides not to answer. Like he's just not going to bother touching that. And so you really find out a lot more about his priorities, but it also kind of detracts from this, intimacy that the letters to a young poet have always had. You in a way don't want to see him answering some guy. You want to pretend he's speaking directly to my soul. And so it became this kind of tricky balancing act of how do we give both sides without taking away from the fact that like you, the reader, want to be on the other side. You don't want to watch him talking to some other guy. You want to feel him talking to you. So even very concrete, practical decisions like, do you alternate the letters and put everything in chronological order like a correspondence? Or do you keep the classic 10 Rilke letters as their thing and put everything else in an appendix? Spoiler, we decided to do the latter pretty much. So at the end of Rilke's third letter, there's a little choose your own adventure note, like flip the page 80 if you want to see Capus's response, but we're still having all of Rilke's letters up front. I actually tried it the other way first. I had been thinking about this, and so I handed in my draft of the translation to the editors with it in alternating chronological order. And they were like, why don't you try putting it at the end? Like, you kind of, the Capus letters are very interesting in their own right, but they're not as good as Rilke's, of course. I mean, how could they be? So you don't want to kind of dilute the Rilke experience too much, even as you're trying to give people a sense of what the correspondence is like.
absolutely. I think it was a very smart decision, and it really is a terrifically made book from the size and the binding and how it's organized. So I don't think it's a spoiler to say that that we still get the Rilke letters as a sort of cosmic blast. and yet we have all this other stuff around it. I like to think of it as a director's cut of Letters to a Young Poet with all these extras now.
Yeah, that's
Um,
right. There's the audio commentary, and well, I
yeah,
mean, even
and
that
your
too.
beautiful introductions. So your
Thanks.
the prose that you add is are very helpful. Um,
The other translations typically did not do notes. The very few, there's one or two like much more academic translations that have notes, but in general, you know, I think people took the right decision, which is if Rilke's not explaining who this guy is, this writer of the past, then we don't need to find out anything other than what he says to this guy. Um, but once there was the two-sided conversation, it really was a bit more historically grounded. So I put some, pretty minimal, especially for Rilke's part, notes at the end, again, to not interrupt the reading experience. But that too is a decision of like, well, is this book for the next round of 18-year-olds who's going to get it as graduation presents? Or is it for us old geezers who like read the book 25 years ago and now like, hey, now there's the other side, so you should read it again? Well, obviously we hope it's both, but you still have to balance that.
it's yeah. I don't want to get too far away from uh, where you started, which was with thinking about the previous translations. And I would love it if you could just give us a blast of that, how you, uh, uh, where we might see, uh,
Sure.
how you approached it differently.
Yeah. This is quite a rabbit hole that one could go down, and I'm not gonna go down it, but maybe just a sentence or so from
Fantastic.
um, the earlier translations. So the Norton translation, I actually think is excellent. It's just old. I mean, it's just from the 1930s. So there are kind of constructions and turns of phrase that we just don't really use that much anymore. One example might be from the beginning. Now I have to juggle 1 second. So right at the beginning, after Kappas has sent Rilke a poem of his own and, said, what do you think? Am I a real poet? Rilke says, I cannot analyze the nature of your poetry. Efforts at criticism are alien to me. When we try to get at then this is my translation now. When we try to get at a work of art, words of criticism fail worse than anything. They give rise only to more or less happy misunderstandings. That's kind of a famous quote. The Norton translation is, all critical intention is too far from me. With nothing can one approach a work of art so little as with critical words. And that's just like a bit too roundabout for our taste now, putting the with nothing and the one. So that by itself is a sort of reason to retranslate, just because readers now find that kind of sentence off-putting, and there's no reason for it. It's not like Rilke was being difficult. It's not even that Rilke was using an old-fashioned German sentence structure. That's just what English was like in the 30s, and so that's how it was translated. With the Stephen Mitchell, which is much more recent, it's from the 80s, I at first thought like, oh yeah, it's not bad, but then as I got into my translation and really was going through the book sentence by sentence, I increasingly felt that I was doing something different than Stephen Mitchell was doing. His Rilke in general, his poetry translations as well as the prose, emphasizes this kind of priestly, Vatic, in some ways a little bit abstract and foggy, like elevated tone, which is great. I mean, that's what a lot of us want from Rilke. We want the like fog machine and the swirls of cosmic thought and all this kind of stuff. But the other way to look at it is that there's sort of a lot of stuff that's in the air that doesn't need to be there. And instead you can just kind of cut to the chase a little more. So one example there would be, maybe I'll read the Mitchell first. And this is a letter from December 23rd. My dear Mr. Kappas, I don't want you to be without a greeting from me when Christmas comes, and when you, in the midst of the holiday, are bearing your solitude more heavily than usual. So that's Stephen Mitchell's. And when I was reading this before saying yes, I was like, okay, that's fine, that's good. Here's what I ended up going with. Dear Mr. Kappas, I mustn't leave you without a word from me when it's Christmas, when your loneliness will be a heavier burden than usual in the midst of all the festivities. And I just feel like you get the human situation more. I mean, you know, he doesn't feel like his family understands him, and so he's home for the holidays and he's feeling alienated and lonely. In the midst of all the festivities, your loneliness is a burden, as opposed to in the midst of the holiday, you're bearing your solitude more heavily than usual. That's just like kind of unnecessarily roundabout. And so for better or for worse, the version of Rilke you get in my translation is kind of a lot more direct. So if you like the smoke and mirrors, you might feel like it's a little flat, but I don't think, I mean, I was trying to strike a balance and just have it be more kind of concretely communicative, especially since we now have the letter from Kappas saying, oh, Christmas is so hard for me because, you know, my parents don't understand me, you know. So in response to that, you wouldn't really want to say you're bearing your solitude more heavily or whatever. Maybe now would be a good time. Should I read a slightly longer bit of mine alone, not to compare?
I think that'd be great. I do want to just respond briefly and say that from my experience reading it, we do have both. It's a more conversational Rilke, but the cosmic Rilke is still there. It's sort of like the difference to me between loud thunder and quiet thunder. Still thunder, and you still know it's powerful and it's coming. You know.
Wait, is mine the loud or the quiet thunder?
Well, I think yours might be the quieter thunder, but
Oh,
it's
okay.
still thunder.
See, I think it's louder. I mean, I think it's in a way more forceful, and force is not the opposite of depth. You know, like you actually can often feel things more deeply if they're said directly than if they're said in this kind of roundabout way.
Yeah, that is something I felt too, that the kindness of you know, Rilke is more evident or than I remembered anyway. But again, it may be our kindness.
No, that's definitely true, because you see who he's answering. You know, like these letters are kind of interesting, but also kind of annoying. And yet Rilke, the letters from Kappas, and yet Rilke really is, you know, making the effort to connect to this stranger who wrote him out of the blue. And you also see how grateful Kappas is to, you know, have these deep, kind, encouraging, you know, answers from Rilke. Here's a little bit from letter 8. You know, many of you out there in Zoom land probably have read this before, and so at least have a sense of, you know, the kind of voice Rilke has and the kind of things he talks about. But here's how my translation style sort of sounds over longer than a sentence. So he says, it seems to me that almost all of our experiences of sadness are moments of tension, which we feel as paralysis because our feelings have been taken aback and we no longer hear signs of life from them. We are alone with this strange thing that has entered into us. Everything familiar and trusted has been taken away for a moment. We're in the middle of a transition and cannot stay there. These are also the reasons why the sadness passes. This new thing inside us, this added presence, has entered our heart, gone into its innermost chamber, and is no longer even there. It is already in our blood. Meanwhile, we never found out what it was. It's easy enough to be convinced that it was nothing, and yet we have changed. The way a house is different once a guest has entered it. We cannot say who has come. Perhaps we'll never know. But many signs seem to indicate that this is how the future enters us, so as to undergo a transformation inside us long before it happens. That's why it's so important when you're sad to be alone and pay attention, because the seemingly uneventful frozen moment when our future sets foot inside us is so much closer to life than that other moment, loud and fortuitous, when it happens to us as if from without. The more patient, quiet, and open we are when we're sad, the deeper and more unerringly the new will enter us, and the better able we'll be to make it ours. The more it will become our fate. And when at some later date it quote unquote happens, which means emerges from us to affect others, the more closely akin to it we will feel inside. So, yeah, that's like this great philosophical, cosmic, fascinating thing. But I think it helps to just say it's important when you're sad to be alone. That kind of language is stronger than, let me look back at the Mitchell here. And that is why it is so important to be solitary and attentive when one is sad.
Yeah.
That's the earlier translation. And mine is, that's why it's so important when you're sad to be alone and pay attention. So
yeah. Well, one is more of a priest and one is more of a person giving the advice. Yeah. And yeah, well, no, that's incredible. And I think also really shows again, like everyone, I can't help but make the connections of our moment, but was sort of reading this book, I was like, oh yeah, it's about solitude. It's about what you can get from being alone and why it's important to try to get that. And the
yeah,
passage you just read certainly is one of the moments in which Rilke goes for it. You know.
yeah. I mean, solitude is one of the very obviously key words in the book. And, you know, I could talk about the translation of just that word, because the thing is that, so German as a language gets kind of all its energy into the nouns. It tends to have very basic verbs, you know, go, have, do, make, put. And then the nouns are these kind of intricate, complex, assembled things that have like a lot of energy in them. English, if you know, from Strunk and White to creative writing classes to whatever, you know, you want to try and get the energy into the verbs. You want to try and have active, precise, sharp verbs, or adjectives are good, but putting things in adverbs kind of slows it down, and getting these kind of like a vast solitude wells up within me instead of I feel lonely. Partly that has to do with German versus English. Now, he is talking about solitude the abstraction. Sometimes there's a famous line in the book about how love is two solitudes bordering each other, stuff like that. So you can't say like two lonely people or something, like you have to say solitudes there. But in general, German will just phrase it in terms of a noun. I have a solitude, where in English you'd say, I feel alone, or I feel lonely. And so a lot of the translation decision is like, well, do you want to use the word solitude or solitary like every single time it comes up in order to keep it consistent and to let readers know that he's like talking about the same thing? Or do you let yourself use words like alone, even though it's a different word, and just sort of trust that the readers will get that if he's, that it's related. And the advantage you have is that you're doing something that's more like English. And so, it's a real translation puzzle every time he talks about solitariness in any of its forms. First of all, you have to decide, does he mean sort of lonely, emotionally sad, or does he just mean sort of factually not around other people?
Right.
Solitary versus lonely kind of mean different things in English, but it's the same word. Or unique. The German word is like onehoodness. You're just in a state of one, like you're not with someone else. And so that has all these different meanings. And so you have to decide both the register and then also like, well, which is it? Is he sad or is he just like isolated?
Right. Right. Were you influenced by the poetry as well as by previous translations of the letters? In other words, does having worked with Rilke's poetry and obviously read many versions of it, was that filtering into what you did with the letters?
That's an interesting question. I think not that much in this case, because I actually think Letters to a Young Poet sort of has a different public identity, or you could even say brand, than the poetry. I think there are a lot of people who read Letters to a Young Poet who never read the poetry. And in years past, when I was someone who was reading and even translating the poetry more exclusively, like Letters to a Young Poet was not my favorite Rilke book back then, partly because it had this kind of pontificating style in the absence of the other letters. Like, I actually like the book a lot more now that it's a much more human interaction between him and Capus than when he's just, mouthing off about all this stuff. I mean, I'm being a little bit exaggerated here. I'm not saying I hated the book, but
Yeah.
I think the letters, which were written 10, 10 or 20 years before the great poetry, is different. I mean, they're different. Like, he's not exactly speaking as the author of the great poetry. He's speaking as like, yeah, I've been a professional, artist for 10 years since I was as old as you are now. And, here are my thoughts and wisdom about that. But I'd say less carryover from the poetry than in most cases of translating two works by the same person.
Sure. And let's just circle back to Kappas. You said a little bit about him earlier, the lonely schoolboy seeking advice, but is there because it becomes fascinating. It's like, oh yeah, what's his life and what became of him and what,
Right.
we learn a
Well,
little bit about this, but by all means, yeah.
That's he lived a lot longer, and in the afterword of the book, where I give Rilke's biography, I also give Kapus's biography and what happened to him. Did he become a poet? Did he sell out? Did he, keep the flame alive? Like, there, I won't give a spoiler. You have to read it for yourself. But in his presence in the letters, um, the editors and the various people at Norton, I think all of them at some point were like, I really like Kapus's letters. They're kind of great. Like, they're not that bad. They're interesting. They're well written. They're good.
Yeah.
And it's true. So I have a slightly, you know, um, sarcastic way of talking about him as like, yeah, this little twerp, writing these annoying letters, partly because, um, he was an Austro-Hungarian military man. So there's a lot of like very flowery, formal language, some of which I ended up stripping out because there are only so many times in English you can say, most honored, respected sir, before whom I bow to the ground. Like, it's kind of normal in Austria-Hungarian military circles, but like, it's way much if you're just like reading it over and over again in English. So
Right.
there is a kind of like fawning, obsequious element, especially at the beginning. But, Rilke really connects with him, and they really are sort of starting to communicate on a more sort of human level
Right.
soon.
Right.
So it's true. He isn't as much of a twerp as I sometimes toss out there. Um,
Well, he is a poet, and we get thanks to this, we get the poems. I mean, I'd forgotten that at one point Rilke, although he avoids giving feedback on the creative writing feedback on the poems, but at one point he handwrites a poem back to Kapus, and you sort of feel the respect in it that like, wow, that's an intense thing to do to the younger person, and
yes,
and
seriously. I mean,
and now we see the poem. Yeah.
imagine if you wrote
Yeah.
some letter to, I don't know, George Saunders or Alice Munro or, you know, Murakami or something, and like sent them a little short story and got back this thing being like, I respected it so much that I typed it out by hand. And here's, now you get to read it as though someone else wrote it. And that's a very important experience for you, young unpublished writer. And not only are you reading it written out, but like Alice Munro typed it out for you.
Yeah.
Like that's amazing.
Yeah, yeah, it's very uh it's very intense. Uh so uh you know boy, time is really flying. I I do want to mention, just because I feel it's such a uh uh I feel it's so often us literary types get pigeonholed, as if we're living and breathing. In your case, as if you're just this living and breathing translation 24/7, and it certainly seems that way. You're uh, as I said earlier, delightfully to all of us readers, extremely prolific at it. But somehow you found the time to write this incredible book, which is a biography of Herman Rorschach and the ink blots. And it startled me to think that no one had written a full length biography of Rorschach before. But then also, especially as I read it, how grateful I was that uh, that 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 someone like you had written it, because you're far more sensitive to the idea that Rorschach is creating his work not only in the shadow of Freud and Jung, but in the context of modern art
Yeah.
and philosophy and literature, and that is really it's a very exciting way to go back and look at this.
Thanks. Yeah, it was kind of the same generalist background and curiosity that led to that project, the Rorschach book, because so there was a Rorschach archives and there was material and letters and things like that. But to the psychiatrists and psychologists, they were perhaps less paying attention to that kind of human cultural story and more to this technique that they were using. Like the inventor of the blood test, it doesn't really matter what they thought about art or what culture they came out of. It's just this technique that if you're a doctor, you use. And so it was really my sense that the Rorschach test as this metaphor had entered the culture and, really tapped into something deep. There are very few ideas from a century ago that are still in common circulation other than Freud's and one or two of Jung's. But every newspaper article about every controversial Supreme Court pick or sports decision or, anything would call it a Rorschach test. And, so not to mention the visual culture of fashion and music videos and credit sequences and like what it means to see something like ink blotty. And so it kind of needed to have someone who could read the archives in these other languages, French and German mostly, and also like who had some sense or ability to kind of give the institutional medical history of, is it valid? Actually, yes, it is currently considered scientifically valid. And, is it still used and where and how? But also was coming at it with a sense of like, what was going on in Switzerland in the teens? It was very interesting. Abstract art was being invented, for example, and like maybe that's relevant to someone deciding that how you see things is an index of how your mind works, and that's the insight of the Rorschach test. So I think it's not a coincidence that no biographer had come along until it was someone who wasn't a psychologist. Like I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a crusader for or against personality testing. I'm someone with this sort of wider sense of what's going on. And then I see, wow, actually, he is really central in all these currents that are going on in his place and time.
Right. And I can't resist asking if Rorschach and Rilke, if there was any interplay, if he would have known of Rilke's work, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, so Rorschach died in 1922 at an extremely young age. He was 37. In fact, we're in the Rorschach test centennial this year. He published it in 1921 and then died almost 6 months later. Rilke died in 1926. He, by the way, was in Switzerland for the last 7 or 8 years of his life after World War I. The Duino elegies, Duino gets the credit, which is the castle that he wrote the first half in, but he finished them in Switzerland. He started writing poetry in French once he was living in bilingual Switzerland. Switzerland was actually pretty important in Rilke's life in a way that is not always recognized. And you have Jung and you have Dadaism being invented, and you have Paul Klee and you have Albert Einstein, and the Magic Mountain is a Swiss sanatorium, and that's going on then, and Hermann Hesse is there. You have these counterculture movements in Switzerland that then come back in the 60s. So this is all going on. I doubt that Rilke knew about Rorschach per se. The test was just published, as I say, in 21, and kind of slowly got famous and got super famous in America later, which is another story I tell in the book. And Rorschach was a literary guy. He translated novels in his spare time. He taught himself Russian and married a Russian woman and spent time in Russia, even hung out with some of the futurists, the Russian futurists, like in Moscow in 1914. And, you know, that's another thing that they have in common. They were both very influenced by Tolstoy and by the sort of spiritual looming presence of Russia. That's a great book that hasn't been written, and I kept looking for it, but it didn't exist, which is just the way America after World War II had this overwhelming cultural influence on Europe, and like things being American was so important. Russia had that before World War One. You have the Russian ballet, and you have Tolstoy, and you have this sense that it's this big, primitive, totalitarian country with the czar, but at the same time, there's this like Dostoevsky and the depth and the passion and the spirituality. And there were Tolstoyan movements all over Europe and things like that. So Rorschach and Rilke were both influenced by that. But I think Rorschach, you know, probably knew about Rilke because Rilke was famous enough, but I doubt he really spent that much time. You know, he read more Russian literature.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating to ponder. Thank you so much, Damien. What a treat it's been to talk with you. To celebrate this, I want to make sure that everyone knows you can buy the book right here on screen with us. You can do it off our website. You can do it wherever you choose, independent bookstore, of course. Um, and please check out our website for future events. We're also, even though we're delighted to be doing so much virtual programming, we still make things. Over my shoulder is issue 100 of Rain Taxi, and we're very thrilled to have hit that milestone. And if you don't already have a copy, um, you can get one from us. You can become a member, and all sorts of ways to keep in touch. So thank you all.
Eric, let
Thank
me
you
just
again,
say one
Damien.
thing. I know
Yes.
we're running a little late, but we did, I feel bad that we didn't really get to any audience questions if there were
Oh,
any.
we
Like,
did. We did. I
oh,
peppered them in here and there. Yeah.
okay,
Maybe not all of them, but we
okay.
did cover some of them. I
Is
had one eye on that. So
okay.
uh,
Are there one or two more that you think we should get to, or
you know, I think that people are well, they're very interested to know what other translations of Rilke and especially the poetry that you've engaged with, and we did talk
well,
a
I have
little
good
bit
news
about
and
that.
bad
Yeah.
news about that. There's a book called The Inner
uh,
Sky: Poems, Notes, Dreams, and that's has a lot of sort of lesser works that he didn't publish in his lifetime, some prose, and it gives a real kind of behind the curtain sense of him not presenting himself as this master, but his sort of insecurities. And um, the bad news is it's selling for like $900 online right
oh dear.
now. It, I guess
Interesting.
it's temporarily out of print or out of stock with the publisher. And you know, my mother just recently told me that a friend of hers had asked about it, and she went and looked it up. And there's like one battered $60 one, and then there are these like $300 ones and stuff. So libraries, but I also have an afterword in there about translating Rilke's poetry
Oh
specifically.
yeah.
And so that might be interesting for people. The book is again called The Inner Sky, and by Rilke, translated by me.
Yes, fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, and I'm just so eager to read and see what it is you bestow on us next. Hopefully, you'll come back here and talk about it.
hopefully I will be able to talk in person.
Yeah. Thanks. Be well. And everyone out there, be well, stay safe, be kind, and we'll see you again shortly. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.